My name is Norman Ross, and the night my own daughter told me to get out of my house, I realized blood ties can cut deeper than any knife. I had prepared daffodils wine and my late wife's china for what I thought would be a reconciliation dinner. Instead, Charlotte stood in my doorway and said coldly, "My husband's family will live here now. You can go to the dump." At that moment, I didn't shout or fight. I simply smiled because what they mistook as surrender was only the first step of a plan. Before this story ends, they would lose everything they tried to steal. But I want to ask you first, where are you watching from and how old are you? Please subscribe to Family Betrayal Unmasked to hear more powerful stories like mine. I'll never forget the sound of that knock. It wasn't gentle, not the rhythm of a daughter eager to see her father after months apart. It was sharp, almost military, as if they were coming to claim enemy territory. When I opened the door, Charlotte stood in front of me dressed in black as though she were attending a funeral, and in a way she was the funeral of our relationship. Her husband Michael reeked of whiskey, and behind him loomed his parents Robert and Margaret, faces tight with disapproval. I had spent the afternoon preparing dinner flowers and wine, foolishly believing my girl wanted reconciliation. Instead, Margaret swept past me as if she already owned the place. She sneered at the daffodils in my wife's crystal vase and said, "Such cheap flowers." My stomach turned cold. These were Charlotte's favorites as a child, and now she let her mother-in-law mock them without a word. Then Robert began photographing my home. He moved with the smug efficiency of a real estate agent, clicking pictures of my dining room, my living room, even my wife's cherished chair. Bewildered, I asked, "What's going on?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "Now my son's family will live here. So get out." Her words struck like a hammer. 30 years of memories, 30 years of repairs bills and quiet evenings with my late wife, all dismissed in a single command. I turned to Charlotte, desperate for even a flicker of the girl I'd raised, the woman who once begged me to carry her on my shoulders. But her eyes were cold as January rain. "Go to the dump if you want," she said flatly. "We need this house." I felt my knees weaken, and I sank into the sofa I had bought the year she turned 16. The chocolate tarts I'd purchased for her sat untouched on the dining table. The wine I'd uncorked to breathe mocked me from its decanter. All my hope for reconciliation was nothing more than a cruel stage for their ambush. Michael stepped closer, his breath sour with alcohol. "Don't make trouble. We already arranged things with the police." His threat was sloppy, but the malice behind it was unmistakable. For a long moment, silence hung over the room. They expected tears. They expected me to beg. They wanted humiliation to break me so they could feel powerful. Instead, I stood, slowly walked to the closet, and pulled out my old leather briefcase. "All right," I said quietly. My voice carried none of the panic they anticipated. Margaret's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Robert lowered his phone for the first time. Michael's posture faltered, and Charlotte shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing that the calm in my tone was more dangerous than anger. "I'll pack some things," I continued. "But remember, I've been an engineer my whole life. I know how to build things." I looked directly at Charlotte before adding, "And I also know how to tear them down." Her lips parted as if guilt flickered for an instant. But then Michael barked her name and she turned away. I carried my worn suitcase into the bedroom, the same one my wife Helen and I had shared for more than 3 decades. Every wall, every shelf carried reminders of a life built with patience and sacrifice. My hands trembled as I opened the closet, but not from fear. The tremor was memory, birthdays, Christmas mornings, graduations, all flashing before me like old film reels. And now my daughter wanted it erased. I pulled my shirts from their hangers with the same mechanical precision that had guided me through 40 years of engineering projects. Each fold, each placement in the suitcase was methodical, controlled. They thought they had stripped me of dignity, but discipline remained mine to command. As I packed, my eyes fell on Helen's photograph from our anniversary dinner. She wore her favorite blue dress, her smile warm enough to soften even my hardest days. I slipped the frame carefully between layers of clothing, whispering, "You'll guide me through this." My briefcase lay open on the bed. Into it, I placed my most valuable tools, not wrenches or schematics this time, but documents, bank statements, insurance policies, the deed to the house, certificates of investment. Everything I had organized over the years, prepared not for this day, but ready all the same. I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I was leaving equipped. Charlotte appeared in the doorway, her silhouette stiff, her eyes searching my face. For a moment I thought I saw hesitation, maybe regret. But then her husband's voice echoed down the hall, "Charlotte, come on." She looked away, her jaw tightening, and walked off without a word. That small flicker of conscience vanished as quickly as it appeared. I zipped the suitcase, the sound loud in the silence of my dismantled home. When I wheeled it into the living room, the four of them watched me like vultures circling a wounded animal. Robert resumed his photographs this time, snapping the china cabinet and Helen's crystal collection. Margaret sat in Helen's chair, as if claiming a throne, moving pillows around with smug entitlement. Michael uncorked the wine I had opened earlier and poured himself a glass, not even pretending to ask. And Charlotte, my daughter, stood in the corner, arms folded, avoiding my eyes. "The utilities are in my name," I said evenly, my hand on the suitcase handle. "You'll need to transfer them. We'll handle everything." Robert replied, dismissive as ever. I paused at the front door and studied them one last time, the people I had loved, supported, sacrificed, for now reduced to opportunists gloating over their conquest. Margaret's smirk, Michael's arrogance, Robert's greed, Charlotte's silence. They expected me to crumble in front of them, to leave with nothing but shame. Instead, I straightened my shoulders and said, "I suppose this is goodbye." None of them answered. The evening air hit me with a sharp chill as I stepped outside. March in Portland carried winter's last bite, but that cold felt cleaner than the poisoned warmth of the house I had just left. I loaded my suitcase into the Honda Helen, and I once bought together, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. My house, my life's work, grew smaller with each block. Yet I wasn't defeated. I was retreating on purpose, because an engineer never abandons a structure. He studies its weak points before dismantling it. And soon, I promised myself, they would learn that lesson the hard way. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, but it was mine, and more importantly, it was temporary. I set my suitcase by the bed and sat down, letting the events of the evening wash over me like a cold tide. I had been cast out of my own home, stripped of the very place where I raised my daughter, where Helen and I built our life brick by brick. Yet as I stared at the peeling wallpaper and the thin curtains swaying against a drafty window, I felt something stirring beneath the pain, a clarity I hadn't felt since Helen's funeral. They thought humiliation would break me. Instead, it hardened me. I opened my laptop, the familiar glow bringing back memories of long nights designing systems and solving complex problems at work. This, I realized, was no different. Every structure, whether steel, concrete, or human ambition, has fault lines. My task was to find theirs. I began with finances, pulling up my bank accounts. Years of saving, pension deposits, Social Security. I wasn't wealthy, but I was secure. Then I remembered something Charlotte had likely forgotten: the checking account we opened together when she was 16. She had begged me back then to teach her responsibility, and I had kept my name on the account to guide her. She never removed me. Out of curiosity, I logged in. My lips curved into the first real smile I'd felt all day. The balance was healthy, and with my co-ownership, I had control. They had taken my house, but they had left me a lever. The following morning, I drove to a budget electronics store. I purchased a prepaid phone and a basic laptop with cash, no trail, no ties. The clerk barely looked at me, but I was already envisioning how I would use these tools. Back in the motel, I laid everything out on the desk: laptop, phone, notepad. Each item represented a step toward something larger. By evening, the beginnings of a plan were forming. I created 4 folders, each with a name: Charlotte, Michael, Robert, Margaret. For Charlotte, I listed her routines, her dependencies on money, her vulnerability to financial pressure. For Michael, I jotted down what I already knew: his love of drinking, his reckless temper, and left space for what I suspected I'd soon uncover. For Robert, I scribbled business dealings with a note to investigate public records. For Margaret, I simply wrote dependent on Robert. The pieces weren't clear yet, but I could already see how they might fit together. As I sat back, I thought of Helen again. She used to tell me, "Norman, you're too methodical, even in your anger." Tonight, that felt less like a criticism and more like a blessing. I wasn't going to storm back into that house and shout. I wasn't going to beg them for scraps of the life I built. No, I was going to dismantle them the same way I once dismantled faulty blueprints, patiently, systematically, until the whole structure collapsed under the weight of its own flaws. I turned off the motel lamp and lay on the thin mattress, listening to cars hum past on the highway. Sleep came slowly, but with it came resolve. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The next morning, sunlight leaked through the thin motel curtains, pale and weak, like a reminder that life had gone on without me. I rose early, shaved and dressed as if I were heading to work. Old habits die hard, and I knew discipline would keep me sharp. Over weak motel coffee, I spread my notes across the desk. 4 folders, 4 names, 4 targets. It no longer felt like I had lost a home. It felt like I had been given a problem to solve. And problems were what I had spent a lifetime mastering. I began with Charlotte. She was the one who had looked me in the eye and told me to leave. My daughter, the child I had once carried on my shoulders, had chosen her husband's family over me. But she had also chosen convenience over independence. Every bill, every major purchase in her life had leaned on me in some way. That joint account would be her downfall, and I smiled grimly at the thought of watching her confidence crumble when she realized she no longer held the purse strings. Michael came next. Even before last night's drunken swagger, I had known what kind of man he was. Reckless, arrogant, the type who mistakes loudness for strength. My gut told me there were cracks beneath that bravado, habits that drained money and trust alike. Gambling affairs I didn't know yet, but I would find out. And when I did, I would shine a light so bright it would blind him. Robert and Margaret were easier to read. Robert struck me as the type who lived beyond his means, always pretending to be wealthier, sharper, more successful than he was. That kind of pride leaves a paper trail: unpaid taxes, failed ventures, hollow investments. Margaret's power came entirely from her husband's standing, and if Robert's house of cards fell, she would fall with him. By noon, I had mapped out what I called Phase 1: gathering evidence. I needed photos, documents, and proof that could stand on its own. Not rumor, not suspicion. Evidence. I purchased a second-hand camera from a pawn shop down the street, cash only, and tested the zoom lens from the motel parking lot. The precision felt good in my hands, like holding a new kind of tool. That night, I drove past my old house. The lights were on shadows moving across the curtains. My chest tightened, but not from longing, it was calculation. I parked a block away and watched as Michael stumbled to the curb to smoke. His movements were sluggish, careless. I snapped the first of many photos, the shutter clicking softly like a secret promise. As I drove back to the motel, a thought struck me. They believed they had erased me. They believed humiliation had ended me. But what they failed to understand was simple humiliation doesn't destroy a man like me. It sharpens him. And if I had learned anything in 40 years of engineering, it was this structure's collapse not with one heavy blow, but with the careful removal of the right supports. Tomorrow I would start removing theirs. By the 5th day, the motel room no longer felt like exile. It felt like a workshop. The desk was cluttered with notes, receipts, and printouts. My folders, Charlotte, Michael, Robert, Margaret, had begun to thicken with details. Each page was a beam removed, each photo a nail pulled loose. Their house of cards was swaying, though they didn't know it yet. Still, I needed a spark, a first move that would send a tremor through their confidence. The joint account. It was my lever, and now the time had come to use it. At 10 o'clock sharp, I walked into the familiar lobby of First National Bank. The same manager, David Ortiz, still worked there, though the gray in his beard had deepened. We shook hands, and I handed him the paperwork I had prepared the night before. "I want to change the permissions on this joint account," I said calmly. "Establish myself as the primary holder and set strict withdrawal limits for the secondary." He read the forms with the practiced eye of a man who had seen thousands of disputes. "Are you certain you want to do this?" "Mr. Ross, it will block significant access for the other holder." "I'm certain," I replied. "I want a $200 daily cap. Anything larger requires my written approval." With a few strokes on his keyboard, the change was official. He slid the confirmation papers across the desk, and I signed them with steady hands. The account, which had been a lifeline for Charlotte's everyday life, was now a tether she couldn't control. I left the bank and walked 2 blocks to a small cafe. The coffee was better than the motel's sludge, but it was the anticipation that made each sip taste rich. I opened my new laptop, logged in, and checked the account activity. Within hours, the notification arrived. Attempted withdrawal denied. Another attempt. Another failure. I could almost hear the panic from across town. By mid-afternoon, Charlotte's number lit up my prepaid phone. I didn't answer. The voicemail arrived seconds later. "Dad, something's wrong with the account. The bank says you restricted access. This must be a mistake. Please call me." Mistake. That word lingered in the air as I replayed the message. For her, my choice was inconceivable. She had always believed my love was unconditional, my support endless. But fathers are not bottomless wells, and betrayal has a way of drying the deepest springs. When the second voicemail came, her voice sharper, nearly frantic, I let it play out while I calmly made dinner on the motel's tiny stove. "Dad, I can't pay rent. My card was declined in front of my co-workers. Please, whatever this is, fix it." I sat at the table eating in silence, listening to her desperation. It wasn't cruelty that kept me from picking up. It was clarity. For the first time in years, the balance of power had shifted. They had thrown me out of my own home, but now I had reached into theirs unseen and pulled away the floor beneath their feet. That night, as I filed the voicemails into Charlotte's folder, I allowed myself one small thought. The first domino had fallen, and by the time the last one tipped, they would understand the cost of underestimating me. The morning after I restricted the account, I woke earlier than usual, restless with anticipation. The motel's thin curtains let in a pale light, and for the first time since being cast out, I felt something close to purpose. They thought I was a man left adrift, stripped of everything. But I was an engineer, and engineers don't collapse under pressure, they design under it. I brewed another cup of the motel's bitter coffee and laid my 4 folders across the desk. Charlotte's was already swelling with evidence of her dependency. Her frantic voicemails from yesterday proved what I had always suspected. Without my steady hand, she faltered. That account restriction was more than a financial inconvenience, it was a test, and she had failed it within hours. But today my eyes shifted to Michael's folder. My son-in-law had always carried himself like a man with something to hide. His eyes never met mine directly, his handshake was limp, and his laugh too loud, like someone performing confidence instead of possessing it. If Charlotte was dependent, Michael was dangerous, not through strength, but through weakness. Weak men destroy families faster than strong ones. That afternoon, I drove downtown and parked outside Henderson Development, the company where Michael supposedly worked. I didn't go inside. Instead, I waited in the car watching the flow of employees. At 11:30, Michael emerged with a woman who was clearly not my daughter. She was younger, polished, and her hand lingered on his arm a little too long. They walked to a nearby cafe close enough for me to photograph them through the zoom lens. I snapped each moment, the touch on the shoulder, the kiss on the cheek, the way his eyes darted around like a guilty man. Every click of the shutter was another nail in the coffin he had built for himself. When they parted ways, I followed Michael at a distance. He didn't return to the office. Instead, he drove to the Riverside Casino. Inside, I watched from the bar, nursing a ginger ale as he threw down chips with reckless abandon. His face grew redder, his movements more desperate, until he staggered away from the table, nearly empty-handed. The bartender, a woman with tired eyes, confirmed what I suspected. "That guy's been here a lot lately," she said. "Losing more than he can afford." By the time I returned to the motel, Michael's folder held photographs of infidelity, gambling, and recklessness. It was a file that could ruin a man both professionally and personally. I laid it next to Charlotte's folder, the two of them side by side, their vulnerabilities intertwined. She depended on his paycheck. He depended on her ignorance. And I now had the power to collapse both. That evening, as I poured a glass of wine and reviewed the evidence, I felt a strange calm. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was inevitability, the same calm I used to feel when I knew a bridge design would hold against every test. They had underestimated me, and soon they would discover that the man they discarded was the man they should have feared all along. The day after tracking Michael, I turned my attention to Robert and Margaret. If Michael was a loose cannon, his parents were the architects of arrogance. From the very first time I met them, Robert looked at me as if I were a hired hand rather than his daughter's father, and Margaret barely disguised her disdain for Helen's modest crystal collection. They had carried themselves into my home like conquerors, convinced my years of hard work and discipline were beneath them. Pride like that always hides cracks, and I was going to find them. I began with public records. The county clerk's office was quiet that morning, the kind of government building where the air smells of dust and old paper. I requested files under Robert Miller's name, and the clerk handed me a stack without question. Sitting at a long oak table, I sifted through the documents with steady hands. It didn't take long to uncover the rot. Robert had poured money into a restaurant venture that had collapsed within 18 months. Creditors had lined up, and while some debts were paid, others lingered in collections. A tax lien of $43,000 sat like a tumor in the file. Then there was the suspended business license, a penalty for failing to pay state fees. For a man who prided himself on appearances, Robert's empire was nothing but rotting wood painted over with glossy veneers. Margaret, that I realized, had no identity outside her husband's illusions. Her name appeared on none of the ventures, none of the properties. She survived entirely on Robert's income. If his foundation cracked, she would plummet right alongside him. I copied every relevant document, carefully folded them into Robert's folder, and smiled at the growing weight of evidence. That afternoon, I stopped by a small print shop and had duplicates made. One set for safekeeping, one for use when the time came. Evidence like steel beams needed redundancy. Back at the motel, I spread all 4 folders across the bed. Charlotte's dependency, Michael's vices, Robert's debts, Margaret's fragility. It was a structure built on weakness. All I had to do was remove the right supports, in the right order, and the whole house would collapse. Later that night, I drove past my old home again. The windows glowed shadows, moving across rooms that had once been mine. Through my listening device, planted during an earlier reconnaissance, I heard fragments of conversation. Charlotte's voice was sharp, almost frantic. Dad's account is blocked. I couldn't even buy groceries today. Michael mumbled something about selling items, his words slurred. Then Robert's voice cut in, firm but uneasy. Stay calm. He won't fight us. He doesn't have it in him. I leaned back in my car seat and let the words wash over me. They still underestimated me. They thought humiliation had made me powerless. They thought I was a man broken by betrayal. But betrayal doesn't break a man like me. It builds him into something sharper, colder, more deliberate. And soon, they would learn the difference. I woke the next morning with a renewed sense of focus. The folders were no longer just collections of information, they were blueprints for demolition. Charlotte and Michael's lives were bound together, but in truth their weaknesses pulled in opposite directions. She clung to financial stability while he bled it away. All I had to do was pull the thread, and the unraveling would take care of itself. I began with the bank account. The restriction was already working. Charlotte's frantic voicemails proved that, but it wasn't enough to merely frustrate her. I needed pressure, the kind that gnawed at her pride and forced her to face the consequences of betrayal. At 9 a.m, I called the bank manager, David Ortiz, and asked to be notified of every withdrawal attempt made by the secondary holder. His tone was professional, but I could hear the curiosity beneath it. Of course, Mr. Ross. You'll receive an alert with each attempt. By noon, the alerts began. $10 at a coffee shop denied. $200 at a grocery store denied. $50 at a gas station denied. Each ping on my phone was like a bell tolling for Charlotte's unraveling. I imagined her standing at the counter card, declined her coworkers, watching the embarrassment burning her cheeks. It wasn't cruelty that made me let it happen. It was clarity. She needed to feel what I had felt when she cast me aside, powerless, humiliated, discarded. Meanwhile, Michael was crumbling under his own weight. I followed him that afternoon to the Riverside Casino. He looked worse than before. Shirt-wrinkled eyes, bloodshot, his steps unsteady. He slid into a blackjack seat with desperation etched into every movement. The bartender, Linda, spotted me again and leaned in. "Your guy's running out of luck," she muttered. "He's promised people he'll pay them back once the house sells." The house. My house. Hearing those words almost made me laugh. He was already counting the profit on something he didn't truly own. I snapped photos, his wild gestures at the dealer. His flushed face as chips disappeared, his stumble toward the exit with empty pockets. Each photo was more damning than the last. When he finally left, I trailed him discreetly. Instead of heading home, he detoured to a small apartment building downtown. I parked across the street, camera ready, as the same auburn-haired woman from earlier greeted him at the door. This time there was no ambiguity. He kissed her deeply before disappearing inside. I snapped the picture, the final nail. Adultery, gambling, alcoholism. Michael wasn't a crack in their family foundation. He was a sinkhole. That evening, back at the motel, I laid the photos across my desk in neat rows. On one side, Charlotte's denied transactions and voicemails. On the other, Michael's casino slips and affair. Together, they painted a picture of collapse already in progress. I didn't need to strike hard. I only needed to wait. Pressure builds slowly in a structure, but when it gives way, it falls all at once. And I was ready to be there when theirs did. By Thursday morning, I had assembled enough evidence to bury Michael and crack Robert's facade. The folders were heavy now, thick with documents, photographs, and recordings. But I knew evidence alone meant nothing unless placed in the right hands at the right time. Revenge is like engineering timing and placement matter as much as strength. I began with Robert. The Oregon Department of Revenue had an anonymous submission box for suspected tax irregularities. I packaged copies of his liens, failed business records, and questionable deductions into a neat manila envelope. The clerk at the counter didn't raise an eyebrow as she stamped it and tossed it into a basket marked "Investigation Required." That was the beauty of bureaucracy, slow, deliberate, but inevitable. The process was in motion, and once it started, no charm or intimidation could stop it. Next was Michael. I printed 2 envelopes, one addressed to Henderson Development's Human Resources Department, the other to Charlotte's office. Both contained photos of Michael gambling during work hours, drinking at lunch, and stepping into his mistress's apartment. I didn't need to add accusations. The images spoke louder than words. I mailed the HR envelope first, knowing Henderson prided itself on reliability and family values. Michael's days of steady employment were numbered. On the way back, I drove past my old house. Through the listening device I had planted earlier, I caught Charlotte's voice sharp with anger. "Dad's account is locked. I can't pay rent, can't buy groceries." My co-workers laughed when my card declined. Michael mumbled something incoherent, and Robert snapped, "Calm down. He doesn't have it in him to fight." I almost laughed out loud. They still believed I was powerless. That evening, I returned to the motel and poured myself a modest glass of wine. It wasn't celebration, it was acknowledgement. The first domino had already fallen when Charlotte's card was declined. The second was tilting now with Michael's gambling exposed. Robert's tax investigation would take longer, but bureaucracy had a way of grinding slowly and crushing completely. At 11:30 that night, my phone buzzed with an alert from the bank. Charlotte had attempted another withdrawal, this time for $1,000. Denied. Another attempt. Denied. I could almost hear her panic growing with each failure. 15 minutes later, my prepaid phone lit up. I let it ring. The voicemail came through, her voice breaking. "Dad, please, I don't know what's happening. I can't pay the mortgage. Michael lost more money. We're drowning. Please help us." I saved the voicemail and filed it into her folder. It wasn't proof of crime, but it was proof of something more important: dependency. She had discarded me like I was nothing, yet here she was, unable to stand, without the foundation I had laid. I leaned back in the motel chair, staring at the 4 folders spread before me. Charlotte's panic, Michael's recklessness, Robert's debts, Margaret's silence. 4 pillars of a collapsing structure. And tomorrow I would kick out another support beam. Because when you've spent a lifetime building bridges, you also know exactly how to watch one fall. Friday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of a blueprint finalized. My desk at the motel resembled less of a temporary workspace and more of a command center. 4 folders, a prepaid phone buzzing with alerts, a laptop humming softly, everything aligned with precision. Today was not about gathering more evidence. Today was about triggering the next collapse. At 9, Henderson Development's HR department opened its doors. By 10, my envelope was sitting on the desk of Michael's supervisor, filled with photos of him gambling during work hours and stumbling drunk out of casinos. Henderson built its reputation on trust and stability. Men like Michael weren't liabilities, they were explosives waiting to detonate. I didn't need to guess how they would react. By noon, my listening device near the house caught Charlotte's phone ringing off the hook. They fired me. Michael's voice cracked, slurred with panic. Just like that, Charlotte. Someone sent them pictures me at the casino at the bar with her. Her reply was quiet at first, then sharp as a whip. With who, Michael? I didn't hear his answer, but I heard the silence that followed. Then Charlotte's voice turned deadly calm. I want half of everything. Don't you dare lie to me. Papers rustled, something crashed, and Michael's pleas turned into muttered excuses. The affair had detonated right on schedule. Meanwhile, Robert's problems were compounding. At 3 in the afternoon, I listened as Charlotte made a frantic call. Dad's locked us out of the account, Michael lost his job, and the tax office just sent you a letter. What are we going to do? Robert's response was a low growl, but not confident this time. We'll manage. We always do. Yet the tremor in his voice betrayed him. The empire he pretended to command was already buckling. That evening, I spread the evidence across my motel table once again. Michael's termination, his affair exposed, Robert's tax investigation underway, Charlotte's dependence unraveling by the hour. Margaret. She hadn't spoken much. Perhaps she believed silence made her untouchable, but silence in a collapsing structure is just the pause before it falls. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat back, letting the hum of the city outside blend with my thoughts. They had thought eviction was victory. They had laughed as they told me to leave. But they had underestimated the resilience of a man who built a life from nothing, brick by brick, blueprint by blueprint. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't raised a hand, hadn't broken a single law. And yet already their world was crumbling faster than they could patch it together. As I closed the folders for the night, I thought of Helen again. She would have reminded me that revenge without purpose corrodes the soul. But this wasn't about cruelty anymore. It was about balance. They tipped the scales when they threw me out. I was only resetting them. Tomorrow, I promised myself, Phase 3 would begin. And when it did, there would be no mistaking the difference between a man broken and a man rebuilt for war. I knew they wouldn't stay quiet forever. When desperate people feel the ground sliding beneath them, their first instinct is to lash out. Saturday morning, the knock came sharp, official, unmistakable. Through the peephole, I saw 2 uniformed officers, and behind them, sitting smugly in the back of a patrol car, was Margaret Miller. Her arms were crossed, her chin tilted high, her expression the picture of triumph. I opened the door, calm as ever. Mr. Ross, the taller officer, began. We've received a complaint. The Miller family says you've been threatening them, harassing phone calls, intimidation, financial sabotage. They want you to leave them alone. I stepped aside and gestured toward the table behind me. Neatly stacked bank statements, copies of investment receipts, letters from my attorney, all laid out like exhibits in a courtroom. Gentlemen, I said, you're welcome to look. What you'll find is not harassment, but documentation. I restricted access to a joint account I legally own. I consulted my attorney about property investments. And as for the tax concerns, I simply filed an anonymous report with the Department of Revenue. That's well within my rights as a citizen. The shorter officer thumbed through the papers, his face shifting from official sternness to mild annoyance. "These look legitimate," he muttered. The taller one glanced at me, then back toward Margaret in the car. "What exactly do they claim you've done again?" "Made life inconvenient," I replied evenly. "But inconvenient isn't illegal." They left 20 minutes later, apologetic more than accusatory. I watched through the blinds as Margaret's face crumpled from smug certainty into seething frustration when the officers shook my hand before departing. The patrol car pulled away. Her eyes locked on my window, but I didn't bother hiding. Let her see me standing tall. Let her know intimidation wouldn't work. Still, their attempt confirmed what I had suspected. They weren't just panicking, they were organized. If Margaret was going door to door with lies, if Robert was paying for lawyers, if Michael was drowning in debt, then Charlotte was caught in the middle of their chaos. And chaos makes people reckless. That afternoon, I heard her voice through the listening device at my old house. "It's not working," she snapped at her in-laws. "The police didn't believe you. Dad's not answering me. Michael's out of a job. We're sinking, and you're making it worse." Robert barked back, "Calm yourself. He's bluffing. He can't really hurt us." Michael mumbled something about money, his words too slurred to catch. But Charlotte's response cut through clear as day. "You don't understand. My father doesn't bluff." I sat in my motel room, the corners of my mouth curling. At last, a flicker of truth. She had grown up watching me solve problems others thought impossible. She had seen me steady under pressure, relentless in pursuit of a solution. And now, even in her betrayal, some part of her remembered. They had underestimated me once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. Sunday afternoon, the weather turned gray, the kind of Portland sky that pressed low and heavy. I stayed in my apartment, sipping coffee and reviewing notes when my listening device picked up Margaret's shrill voice outside my old house. She wasn't satisfied with calling the police. Now she was going door to door, trying to poison my neighbors against me. "Mrs. Patterson?" She said, her voice sugar-sweet but edged with venom. "I feel you should know the truth. That man, Norman Ross, is dangerous. He's been threatening our family, trying to take our home away. You should be careful." I almost laughed. Mrs. Patterson had known me for 30 years. She'd seen me mow her lawn when her husband was sick, had borrowed sugar from Helen countless times. Margaret thought a few whispered lies would erase decades of neighborly trust. She underestimated history. Through the device, I heard Mrs. Patterson's flat reply. "Has he actually done anything illegal, Margaret?" "Well, no," Margaret faltered. "Then maybe you should talk to him directly instead of dragging the neighborhood into your business." The door closed with a firm click, leaving Margaret's words hanging in the cold air. She moved on to the Johnsons next, rehearsing the same performance, her tone wobbling as each polite but skeptical neighbor refused to play along. By the time she reached the Millers down the street, no relation, just unfortunate name, coincidence, her desperation bled through. "He's vindictive, unstable. You can't trust a man like him." The Miller couple simply shook their heads. "Norman's been here longer than anyone. He shoveled our driveway after last winter's storm. He's no threat." Margaret's heels clicked angrily on the sidewalk as she stormed back toward my house. Through the device, I heard her slam the door, her voice rising into a shriek. "No one believes me. They think he's the victim." Robert muttered something about finding another way. Michael, ever the coward, kept silent, and Charlotte, poor, conflicted. Charlotte finally snapped. "Maybe it's because you're lying, Margaret. Maybe it's because people know my father isn't what you say he is." I paused, the coffee cooling in my hand. For the first time since that night, my daughter had defended me, however faintly. The words weren't for me. They were born of her own frustration, but still they mattered. Somewhere under the weight of manipulation and pride, A part of her remembered the man who raised her. I leaned back in my chair, letting the voices fade. Margaret thought she could dismantle my reputation with gossip, but reputations like bridges are built over years of steady work. Mine was steel, hers was paper, and the harder she pushed, the more she revealed her own weakness. That evening, I took a slow walk through my new neighborhood. Strangers nodded politely, no whispers, no suspicion. Margaret's campaign had failed before it began, and I knew then that the Miller family's greatest mistake wasn't betrayal. It was assuming the world would side with them. They were alone now, and isolation is the first crack in any collapsing structure. By midweek, their desperation had shifted gears. Margaret's neighborhood smear had failed. The police had walked away unimpressed, and Michael was spiraling without a paycheck. That left Robert the patriarch, who clung to illusions of control. When a man like him feels cornered, he doesn't dirty his own hands. He pays someone else to do it. I spotted the unmarked sedan parked across from my apartment before noon on Wednesday. It wasn't hard. The car had sat there all morning, engine off, driver pretending to read a newspaper. Through the reflection of the diner's window, I caught the glint of a long lens. Amateurs think surveillance is invisible, but to a man trained to notice structural weaknesses, sloppy work stands out like a cracked beam. Later that day, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped outside, walked past the sedan, and glanced at the license plate. Oregon plates registered to a man named Rick Stone. A quick search on my laptop confirmed he was a private investigator, mostly handling insurance fraud cases and runaway spouses. Robert Miller had wasted what little money he had left on the cheapest soldier he could find. That evening, as I brewed coffee, I pulled the blinds back just enough to see Rick still parked there. Camera mounted on the dash lens pointed at my apartment. I let him see me reading, walking to the library, buying groceries. My routines were deliberate, ordinary, boring, flawless. He could sit there for weeks, and the only story he'd capture was of a widower who spent his days quietly. The next morning, I upped the ante. I walked directly past his car, stopped, and tapped gently on the window. He jumped, startled, before lowering it halfway. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to sound confident. I smiled politely. "Coffee shop down the block has the best blueberry muffins in the city. Thought you might get hungry sitting here all day." His eyes flickered, and for the briefest moment, I saw the realization he knew I knew. I returned to my apartment and jotted down the encounter in Robert's folder. Hiring a detective had cost them money they didn't have, and revealed how badly they were flailing. Desperate enemies always make predictable mistakes. Through my listening device that evening, I heard Robert grumble to Margaret. "He's clean. The detective says the man's just shopping, reading, drinking coffee. Nothing illegal." Margaret snapped back. "Then he's hiding it better than we thought." Charlotte's voice cut through, brittle with exhaustion. "Or maybe he isn't hiding anything. Maybe he really is just living his life while we're the ones drowning." Her words silenced the room. Even Michael didn't mutter his usual drunken defense. For the first time, they were starting to doubt their own narrative. I leaned back in my chair, satisfied. Let them waste their money chasing shadows. Let them stew in suspicion while I kept stacking evidence. A structure under stress will often collapse not from external force, but from the weight of its own imbalance. And right now, the Miller family was cracking from within. By Thursday morning, the rhythm of their collapse had become predictable. Every day brought a new tremor. Charlotte's calls grew more frantic, Michael's drinking louder, Robert more irritable, Margaret more venomous. They were a house shaking on its foundations, and I was content to watch. But an engineer knows when observation ends and intervention begins. It was nearly time to press harder. I sat at my motel desk, folders spread like blueprints. I reviewed each one, checking for gaps. Charlotte's dependency was documented in bank records and voicemails, humiliation public enough to sting. Michael's downfall was solid photos of him gambling, drinking, and wrapped in the arms of his mistress. Robert's file contained liens, unpaid taxes, and a suspended business license. Margaret's folder was thin, but it didn't need to be thick. Her power lived entirely through her husband and son. Their collapse would be her collapse. Still, I thought of Helen as I worked. She always said my mind was too rigid, too focused on efficiency. Life isn't an equation, Norman, she would tease. People aren't bridges to be calculated. But in this case, they were. They had turned my home into their fortress, discarded me like scrap metal. Justice, I told myself, required structure, and I had built one step by step. That afternoon, I tested the strength of their denial. I ignored Charlotte's latest voicemail and instead slipped a carefully worded letter into their mailbox, unsigned, but clear. Some structures collapse not from storms, but from the rot within. I wanted them guessing. Was it me? Was it coincidence? Was the world conspiring against them? Fear is more corrosive than anger. Through the listening device, I heard the explosion that evening. Margaret read the letter aloud, her voice sharp. It's him, he's threatening us in riddles now. Robert snapped back empty words. He's bluffing. Michael slurred something about selling the house before it was too late. And Charlotte, my daughter, said nothing for a long while before whispering, "What if he's right?" Her doubt was the crack I had been waiting for. Doubt spreads like water in concrete, freezing, expanding, breaking even the strongest walls. That night, I walked the streets of Portland, in the cool air, passing cafes and bookstores Helen once loved. I felt her presence in my steps, her voice reminding me of the line she'd written decades ago. There's a difference between making them pay and making things right. I wasn't sure yet which path I was walking, but I knew one thing: they would no longer see me as the man they could humiliate. Back in the motel, I organized the folders one last time. Tomorrow I would move from pressure to action, from silent observation to decisive strike. The Miller family believed they had banished me to irrelevance. What they didn't realize was that every day they remained in that house, they were building my case stronger. And when the moment came, I wouldn't just knock down their walls, I would reclaim what was rightfully mine. Friday morning came with a knock louder than usual. Not the hesitant rap of a neighbor, nor the firm cadence of police. It was heavier practiced. I opened the blinds just enough to see Robert Miller standing outside my apartment building, flanked by Michael. Margaret lingered at the curb, arms crossed, while Charlotte stood a step behind them, all her face pale, her arms wrapped around herself. They hadn't sent lawyers this time. They'd come themselves. I let them knock twice more before I opened the door. Robert pushed his way forward, his voice booming with false authority. "Norman, this ends today. We're not going to let you keep ruining us." Michael loomed beside him, his fists clenched, though his red eyes, and the whiskey on his breath robbed him of menace. I didn't flinch. Instead, I gestured toward the kitchen table where neat stacks of documents lay in plain sight. "Ruining you," I said evenly. "No. I've simply let truth do its work." Margaret stormed in without permission, her words a torrent. "You're obsessed, following us, spying, turning the neighborhood against us. You're sick, Norman, and you won't get away with this." I picked up one stack and handed it to Robert. Tax liens, unpaid fees, and a suspended license. Public record. Did I invent that? Or did you? His eyes flickered as he scanned the pages, his bluster faltering. Then I slid Michael's folder across the table. Your son-in-law, I said, drinking on company time, gambling away your supposed fortune, kissing a woman who isn't my daughter. Michael's face drained of color, and Charlotte gasped, clutching the back of a chair for balance. Margaret tried to regain control. None of this will matter. We'll tell the police you're harassing us. They already tried that. I interrupted, my tone calm but sharp, and the officers left with nothing but respect for me. You can scream, you can lie, but evidence doesn't bend to theatrics. Charlotte finally spoke, her voice trembling. Dad, why are you doing this? I met her eyes, the eyes that once sparkled when she brought me drawings from kindergarten. Because you told me to go to the dump, Charlotte. You let them strip me of the house I built with your mother. This isn't revenge, it's restoration. For a long moment the room was silent except for Michael's uneven breathing. Robert slammed the folder shut and shoved it back at me. This isn't over. You're right, I replied. It isn't? Because the courts haven't weighed in yet, and when they do, the eviction order will have more force than your shouting. They left in a storm of mutters and slammed doors, but I noticed something important as they retreated. Charlotte lingered a second longer than the others, her eyes flicking to Helen's photograph on my desk. Regret lived in that glance, faint but real. As the door shut behind them, I exhaled slowly. Their counterattack had collapsed into empty threats. They had nothing left but bluster. And I had everything I needed for the final blow. The morning after their visit, I woke with a calm resolve I hadn't felt in weeks. The shouting, the accusations, even Margaret's venomous insults, they were all noise. Noise fades. Paper endures. That truth had carried me through a career of engineering projects, and it would carry me through this final phase. If phase 1 was pressure, phase 2 was exposure, phase 3 endurance, then phase 4 was about restoration. I wasn't going to simply defeat them. I was going to reclaim what was mine the right way, the way Helen would have wanted. I gathered my folders stacked neatly with colored tabs, marking receipts, tax liens, and photographs. Each piece of evidence had been curated, double-checked, and organized with the same precision I once used to draft blueprints. My late wife's words echoed in my mind. There's a difference between making them pay and making things right. It was time to honor that distinction. At 9 o'clock sharp, I walked into the office of James Parker, my attorney. His walls were lined with diplomas, his desk immaculate. He greeted me with a firm handshake. Mr. Ross, you look like a man with a plan. I said, setting the folders down. They threw me out of my home, but I invested over $23,000 in improvements, roof repairs, foundation, reinforcement, kitchen renovation. I have receipts for all of it. I want the courts to recognize my standing. James adjusted his glasses and leafed through the documentation, nodding slowly. This is airtight. You're not just a resident, you're a financial co-owner in all but name. With this evidence, a judge will have no choice but to restore your rights. We spent hours preparing. He highlighted contractor invoices, flagged key bank transfers, and drafted the petition for emergency relief. His confidence steadied me. For weeks I had operated in shadows, pulling strings quietly. Now I was stepping into the light armed not with tricks, but with proof. That afternoon, we filed the petition with the county courthouse. A clerk stamped the papers, the sound sharp and final like the gavel I was determined to hear. As I walked out into the spring air, I felt lighter. Not victorious yet, but aligned. Every step I had taken, every calculated move had led to this. Back at the motel, I opened Helen's photograph and placed it on the desk beside the court-stamped petition. We're close now, I whispered. Close to bringing our home back. Through the listening device, I caught Charlotte's voice later that evening, brittle with panic. Dad's taking legal action. He's got receipts. He's serious. Robert barked, he won't win. Judges side with families, not bitter old men. But Margaret's tone betrayed her. You don't understand, he's been 2 steps ahead the whole time. If he's going to court, we're finished. For the first time, fear had replaced arrogance in her voice. And I knew then the structure was about to collapse, not from my hand, but from the weight of justice itself. Monday morning, I dressed in the same navy suit I had worn to Helen's funeral. It wasn't just clothing, it was armor. As I stood before the mirror in the motel bathroom, combing my gray hair into place, I whispered to myself, this isn't revenge. This is restoration. I tucked Helen's photograph into my briefcase alongside the evidence. She would be with me in spirit when the judge weighed truth against lies. At the courthouse, James Parker met me at the entrance. Ready, he asked. I've been ready since the night they threw me out, I replied. We entered the courtroom, modest but imposing with its high ceiling and oak benches. The Millers were already seated at the defense table. Robert's jaw was tight, his suit wrinkled from sleepless nights. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin, angry line. Michael fidgeted, his eyes bloodshot. And Charlotte. My daughter sat stiffly, her gaze fixed on the floor. She couldn't meet my eyes. Judge Williams, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, took her seat and called the session to order. James presented first, laying out receipts, invoices, and photographs of the renovations I had funded. Your Honor, he said firmly, Mr. Ross invested over $23,000 into this property. He is not merely a resident. His financial contributions establish equitable interest, granting him standing as a co-owner. He was unlawfully forced out of his home by individuals who lacked both legal authority and moral standing. The judge examined each receipt, nodding occasionally, asking sharp questions. James had answers ready, each one precise. When Robert tried to object, fumbling through excuses, the judge silenced him with a raised hand. Mr. Miller, do you have documentation that disproves these receipts? Robert stammered, We thought the house answered the question, she snapped. No, he muttered, defeated. Then it was Margaret's turn. She launched into a tirade about me being unstable and vindictive, but the judge's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Miller, accusations without evidence are irrelevant here. This court deals in proof, not gossip. Margaret's voice faltered, collapsing into silence. Michael never spoke, not once. He sat slouched, sweating, his hand trembling, as if even he knew the tide had turned. Finally, Judge Williams leaned forward, her voice steady and final. The evidence shows clear financial investment by Mr. Ross. Therefore, he has legal standing. Effective immediately, the property is returned to Mr. Ross, and the defendants are ordered to vacate within 48 hours. Her gavel struck the block, echoing like thunder through the chamber. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound sink in. It wasn't just victory, it was validation. The home Helen and I had built was mine again, not by stealth or shadow, but by law. As I stood to leave, I glanced at Charlotte. For the first time in weeks, she looked up. Her eyes shimmered with something between regret and shame. She opened her mouth, but no words came. I gave her a small nod, acknowledgement, not forgiveness, and walked out of the courtroom with James at my side. The house was coming back to me, and for the Millers, the countdown had begun. 2 days later, I parked across the street from my old house and watched as a sheriff's deputy walked up the front steps. He carried an envelope in his hand, his posture firm and official. Margaret opened the door, her face already tight with suspicion. When he handed her the court order, the change in her expression was almost theatrical, first disbelief, then anger, then the pale realization that this time there was no bluff, no negotiation. The law had spoken, and she had lost. Robert appeared behind her shoulders, sagging under the weight of inevitability. "You can't do this," he barked, but the deputy cut him off. "The court can, sir, and it has. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." Inside, Michael cursed loudly, his words muffled but bitter. Charlotte emerged moments later, suitcase in hand, her movements mechanical. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ground as she brushed past the deputy. For all her pride, she looked small in that moment, like a child again. Except this time, I wasn't there to carry her burdens. From my car, I captured the scene in silence. It wasn't triumph I felt, but confirmation. They had paraded me out of my own home like I was disposable. Now they were the ones walking out, not with cheers or smug smiles, but with boxes and broken dignity. By late afternoon, the house was empty. The sheriff's deputy remained until the last piece of luggage was loaded into Robert's car. Margaret shouted something about injustice, but her voice cracked. Michael slammed the trunk, his jaw-tight eyes hollow. Charlotte climbed into the back seat, her face turned toward the window. I wondered if she saw me watching. When the deputy finally waved me over, I stepped out of my car with slow, steady steps. The keys he handed me were new. The locksmith had changed the locks earlier that morning. "It's yours now, legally and fully," he said. I nodded my thanks, the metal cool in my palm. Crossing the threshold was like walking into a memory. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner from the rushed scrubbing Margaret had done to mask their presence. Dishes sat unwashed in the sink. A magazine was left open on the coffee table. In the bathroom, Charlotte's expensive face cream still sat on the counter, abandoned in haste. They had treated my home like a hotel, never grasping its meaning. I walked through each room slowly. The dining table gleamed through the chair where Margaret had sat, felt contaminated by her arrogance. The living room still held Helen's crystal vase, untouched and unbroken. I paused there, running my fingers along its smooth surface, relieved that one thing had survived their intrusion. Finally, I stood in the master bedroom, my suitcase by my side. Helen's photograph was back on the nightstand where it belonged. I whispered, "We're home," and for the first time since she passed, I felt as though she was near. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting golden light through the windows. This was no longer the scene of my humiliation. It was once again my sanctuary. The first night back in my home, I barely slept. Not because I was unsettled, but because the silence felt different, cleansed, restored. Every creak of the floorboards was familiar again, not an invasion. In the morning, I brewed coffee in my own kitchen for the first time in weeks. The smell filled the house like a benediction. From the window, I could see the Miller's car parked down the block, piled with boxes and luggage. They had nowhere left to go but each other, and the weight of that was already fracturing them. By mid-morning, the phone rang. James Parker, my attorney. "Norman thought you'd like to know the Department of Revenue has opened a full audit into Robert Miller's businesses. I expect indictments will follow." His tone carried the matter-of-fact certainty of a man who had seen plenty of financial predators fall. I thanked him, hung up, and added the note to Robert's folder, though I no longer needed proof. The law would finish what I had begun. That afternoon, my listening device still planted outside, capturing conversations through the paper-thin walls of their borrowed motel, fed me the sound of chaos. Charlotte's voice trembled. "Dad's taken everything back. We're broke. Michael's unemployed and Robert's being audited. What are we supposed to do?" Robert barked back, his voice brittle with strain. "He doesn't have the power to ruin us. He can't." But Margaret's reply cut through, sharp and final. "Open your eyes, Robert. He already has." Michael, drunk again, lashed out. "This is your fault, Charlotte. If you hadn't dragged me into this, I'd still have my job." The crash of glass followed, then Charlotte's muffled sobs. Their fortress of arrogance had collapsed into shouting blame and despair. I closed my eyes and let the sounds wash over me. It wasn't satisfaction, I felt it was inevitability. Structures built on lies don't last, and their house had always been nothing more than a facade. The next morning, a neighbor stopped me while I was sweeping my porch. Norman, Mrs. Patterson said softly, "I heard about what happened." "I just want you to know we never believed a word," Margaret said. "We're glad you're back." Her words warmed me more than she knew. Reputation, I realized, was like a bridge, its strength tested under strain. Mine had held. Theirs had crumbled. Later that day, I drove past the courthouse on an errand and saw Robert hurrying down the steps, face pale, clutching a thick envelope. Margaret followed her expression, tight with panic. Even from across the street, I could see the cracks in their armor. They weren't predators anymore. They were prey cornered by the very system they thought they could manipulate. That evening, I poured a glass of good wine, the kind Helen and I once saved for anniversaries, and sat in her favorite chair. Through the window, the house glowed warmly, no longer tainted by their presence. For weeks, I had been the silent architect of their downfall. Now, justice itself was carrying the work forward. They had stripped me of my dignity once. I had built it back piece by piece. And soon, the world would see what they truly were: not conquerors, not family, but rubble. The call came late in the afternoon, just as the golden light spilled across my kitchen floor. The number flashing on my phone was familiar, my daughter's. I let it ring twice before answering. Dad, Charlotte's voice trembled, stripped of arrogance. "Please, can we talk?" I didn't speak right away. Silence, I'd learned, forces truth out of people faster than questions. She rushed ahead. "Everything's falling apart. Michael's drinking all day. Robert's facing charges. Margaret blames me for everything. I lost my job because I can't focus on anything anymore. Dad, I can't do this alone." I rested my hand on Helen's photograph by the window. The woman who had always reminded me that forgiveness and trust were two different things. "I'm sorry to hear that, Charlotte," I said quietly. Her breath caught. "Are you really sorry? Or are you just glad to see us broken?" I closed my eyes, the ache of betrayal pressing against my ribs. "Both," I admitted. "I won't lie to you. Watching the people who humiliated me face consequences has brought me peace. But that doesn't mean I wanted you destroyed. I wanted you to learn." Her voice cracked. "Dad, forgive me, please. I know I hurt you. But I'm still your daughter." I leaned against the counter, staring out at the garden Helen once tended. "Forgiveness is one thing," I said slowly. "Trust is another. You made your choice when you threw me out of my own home. You told me to go to the dump, remember, and I did. But I built something out of that humiliation." "Can you say the same, Dad?" she whispered. "I can't survive without your money." There it was, the truth unvarnished. Not love, not remorse, survival. I let the silence stretch, then answered gently but firmly. "Then learn. You survived 34 years leaning on me. Now it's time to stand on your own. I won't carry you anymore." Her sobs filled the line, raw and unguarded. For a moment I almost caved. The father in me wanted to fix it, to rescue her from herself. But Helen's words echoed in my mind. Justice makes things right. Revenge only keeps wounds open. "Goodbye, Charlotte," I said softly. "Dad, please," I ended the call. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was final. That evening, I poured a glass of wine, the bottle Helen and I had saved for special occasions. I sat in her chair and raised the glass toward her photograph. "We did it right," I whispered. "Justice, not vengeance." The house felt whole again, not because the Millers were gone, but because my dignity had returned with it. Outside, the world moved on ordinary and unbothered. Inside, I had rebuilt not just a home, but myself. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to smile. The man they tried to erase was standing taller than ever, and their downfall was nothing more than the proof. Looking back, I realized this story was never just about losing a house. It was about losing trust in the one person I thought would never turn on me, my daughter. That betrayal could have left me bitter, but instead it taught me something far more valuable. Dignity doesn't come from possessions. It comes from knowing when to stand firm, when to let go, and when to rebuild. To any parent listening, I say this: love your children, but do not blind yourself to entitlement. A child who sees sacrifice as weakness will only take until nothing is left. And to any child, grown or young, remember this: parents are not endless wells of giving. They are human, and their love deserves respect, not exploitation. Justice came not through rage or revenge, but through patience, discipline, and faith in the truth. I restored my home, but more importantly, I restored my self-respect. Charlotte may one day find her own footing, but that path is hers to walk, not mine to carry. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a betrayal within your own family? How did you handle it, and what lesson did it leave behind? Share your thoughts in the comments. I believe your words could guide someone else through their storm. And if this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for listening.